Hi there, this is Philip from Beyond the Tabletop, and in this video I'm discussing the Warhammer New Year's previews for the 30k reveals, specifically the custodies and the vehicles that they've shown off. Now, like my 40k video, this is actually taken from the Lookout Sir podcast that I also do. This is just a much shorter video segmented out from that podcast. If you want to watch the full 2-hour plus podcast, you can head over to the Lookout Sir YouTube channel or find us on all good podcast apps. That's it for the intro. We'll now get on with the show. So we're now on to the Horus Heresy reveals, which includes the Legio Custodes coming to 30k in plastic for the first time ever. Obviously, these models already exist in 40k and were in plastic back then. And potentially what will be quite interesting to see is, will they keep any of those 40k minis or just get rid of them? So let's have a look at the miniatures and have a bit of a deep dive, because I think to an extent they've been quite controversial and there's some interesting things to discuss about them. So we've got the Legio Custodes Battle Group box, which is how these models are first being released. 15 models, you get 10 of the standard Custodian Guard and their alternate poses. So you can have the Guardian Spear or the Sentinel Blade and Shields, and they all come with the Misericordias, which are their small daggers. We've got the Captain, we've got one of the Dreadnought variant, and then we got one of the Grav tanks. I can make a guess at it being the Palladus, but I don't actually know, so I have to double check that. Let's take a look at the minis. First thing to note is they're sort of a bit slimmer. I think it's mostly because they're taller rather than thinner, but it then gives them a much more leaner proportion, a bit like what we saw with Cataphractii Terminators in Heresy. They have really big helmets. And I actually like that. I love the giant plumes. I love the over-the-top helmet sizes. I know it's not going to be for everyone, but it really does remind me of the old John Blanche artwork when he did some initial concept work for them, going back many years. You can see here with the really tall helmets, which you just didn't quite get in the current 40k version. Noting here that they've got some kind of red skirt robe things going on and sort of leather boots. So it's not like they've done one for one copy of his old artwork, but I feel like they've taken some inspiration from it. The first miniature, it's got the Vexilla, which is the banner. That looks very similar to the style of the 40k version. They've got some really nice details. The one criticism I personally have with them is I think the legs are a bit too bare. The legs do look like Stormcast, and I can't remember who it was, but I saw someone on Facebook talk about this, where they had photoshopped the legs from the 40k version, which has the eagle detail on the sort of shin area, and they put that over the top of these ones. And it did just look a lot better. So if we look quickly at one of the current ones, you can see you've got the Aquila symbol on it. And what's interesting here is actually that knee pad design blends into the shin. It's like all one piece. Whereas this feels like they're two separate pieces, much like the Stormcast. Reiterating how I am invested in this army to an extent, much like with the Corsairs. The Custodes range has always appealed to me on a level, but I've built a Thunder Warrior army using Custodes rules. Sometimes I've used some Custodes heads, but I've obviously been inspired by like the weapons like the Guardian Spear and the swords and the shield to try and do a very WYSIWYG style army. So while visually it looks like Thunder Warriors, they still play as Custodes, so the weapon options are similar. Although sometimes I've sort of done inspired by style of design. And as part of that, one of the base units is the legs being part of the Stormcast Eternals. So that's why I can see the comparison between my models and these new Custodes having Stormcast legs. I don't hate it. it's just a very noticeable, very plain bit of armor where everything else on these new custodies are being adorned with detail. And it might be that was a limitation on the kit or the sprue because you can't have undercuts. So maybe if the legs are particularly one piece, they couldn't have too much detail on there. Or visually, they just wanted to go in a different direction from the 40k versions. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it'll be interesting to see if the 40k ones will stick around as their own distinct identity. Because the Heresy ones, like in this article, they do repeatedly say, yes, you can use it for 40k. Heresy, Custodes, and Knights are the only range that still exists with rules in both 40k and 50k. It's, for whatever reason, it's their niche that they're allowing. Whereas everything else, like the Leviathan, the Contemptors for Space Marines, a load of units, loads of models have all gone to Legends. I think in part because Knights and Custodes in 40k sell extremely well, but they also have a very limited model range. And supplementing that with the Forge World Heresy stuff, they know is a money winner. So I can see these things for that pure financial reason, despite madly every other reason they've gone, well, no, like Contemptors sold extremely well for Space Marines, but for whatever reason they said no, not for that, but yes to this for having rules still in 40k. So that's an interesting one. Anyway, let's move on with looking at some more models. The second set that we see, just more Guardians looking cool. Then there's one who, because there is no like leader of the squad because they're all independent, but there's one that's got a crest that's sort of like a mohawk. But I think in one picture that I saw, maybe it was in the video, it basically isn't actually attached to his head, maybe, or it's a plate that is, but there's a much bigger bit from the back. So I don't know if it's a bit like the Votan crests where it's not actually attached to their head. It's more attached to the piece of armor behind them. I guess we won't know until we get a proper look at the kits. But my initial instinct is these jumbo mohawks they almost look like how I imagine some of my Thunder Warriors do. But I actually don't like this for the Custodes. The giant mohawk looks wrong. I'm not a fan of it personally. It's also worth noting probably at this stage is the other big controversy, and that is the lack of trigger on the Guardian Spear that people have pointed out that did exist on the original kit, but doesn't seem to on the new one. So if we look at this 40k model of a Custodian with a spear, you can see his hand is just on a trigger, which is sort of like halfway down. But it's also worth noting that their spear isn't just like a whole shaft. It's almost like it's like a bit of a rifle, like the mid part of a rifle. So it feels a bit more chunky than just a spear, unlike the DK versions, which are very much like a spear. I've seen people notice that there's like a midsection where there's like a join, and people have been speculating that maybe this is some kind of twist mechanic for activating the bolter. Other people have pointed out there looks like where the power point is, there's essentially like a button there. And then others have been saying that, the Custodes are so high tech, it could be like neural links from their helmets, and they can just, with the power of their mind, fire the gun, which feels particularly in keeping to me. But it goes to show that people do obsess about these little details on models. And, passionately, people want to know the reasons behind things, why there are law changes, what is going on between the realism of the design of a model as well. So that is important to note and see. It's the sort of thing where Games Workshop occasionally on Warhammer Community will do an article where they might go into explaining some of these things. Actually, when I was subscribing to White Dwarf, they were pretty good and did those things as well. And that was one of the more interesting aspects of White Dwarf, is when they have like designer commentary about designs, because it's these little things that we want to know, and that is where they talk about them basically. And Games Workshop did go through a phase maybe like 5 years ago where they would put out like designer interviews on Warcom, where the designers would chat through the designs, like why they made particular changes and things like that. And this would be a great example for that. So yeah, I would love them to do things like that more on Warhammer Community. So we've now got the Sentinels with their blades and shields. Like the shields are really nicely detailed. The swords look phenomenal. And actually, it was only until like last week when I realized that the Sentinel blades, like the hilt, is actually the bolter. The hilt is the ammo clips basically, and then the gun barrel starts at the very bottom of the shaft of the sword blade. Like I never noticed that before on the old 40k ones. If we just go to one of the 40k designs, they do actually exist there. Like you can just about see it, but they're so much more squarer, and you can see that where normally the like the power line goes for the sword, the powered element, that's sort of the groove in which the bolt fires down, and that the power piece is actually to the side, to the left and right on the old one. And then in the new one, slightly confusingly, you've still got that groove for where the bullet goes, but that is also where the powered wired piece also goes. So that is slightly confusing and feels inaccurate, especially when, you know, the gun itself is actually quite recessed and doesn't look completely realistic. Personally, I would be inclined to cut out that little powered line. Realistically, that should be almost like recessed one level down, so it wouldn't be blocking the bullet as it fires down that little groove. But overall, despite that nitpick, the swords look very cool, the hilt looks amazing, and the gun feels much more visibly noticeable. There's another Vexilla design that's a bit smaller with a much more tinier one-headed eagle on top, which looks very cool. Again, they've got the crested helmet bear head, which I don't like. And then we've got a couple more bareheaded options. There's a guy with a full head of hair, which I don't particularly like. And that's just generally, I think custodians should have bald heads or mohawks, but that is just me. Then we've got some of the grav tanks. So we start off with the Calidus Annihilator grav tank, which I believe is the one in the Battle Force box set. I haven't actually double checked, but I assume these are pretty much one for one when it comes to the old resin kits with these new plastic ones. I think when it comes to vehicles in Heresy, they've done a really good job at sort of transposing the old designs to new and being really faithful to them. So I wouldn't be too surprised if these are exactly the same. And yeah, they're really cool minis. I love the sort of the two like large barrels going down both sides of the tank, which is where all the grav plates are. And then the inner bit is the main hull of the tank. So that looks very cool. Then we've got the Contemptor Dreadnought. There's two designs, one with the spear and a fist with some bolters, and similar to the actual custodian guards, you've got blades and then you've got a sword and shield variant. There's clearly a few extra bits of detail that they've added on here in terms of like embellishments on the torso pieces. I kind of think when it comes to the shield version, the shield is just a tiny bit too small and would look a bit cooler if it's a bit bigger. And then with the blade, this time it's not a bolter, it's like a flamer. So that you've got like this little furnace cowling detail at the bottom of the hilt rather than a bolter like on the regular guys. But the dreadnoughts are cool. It sounds like they're really posable. So this is just phenomenal. Hopefully also they'd be a bit more cheaper than the old resin kits as well, because while Heresy in plastic is cheaper than the old resin stuff, it's still quite expensive, but it's not as bad as it used to be. So the fact that Custodies with the cool new toys will be a lot more accessible from a financial point of view is great. It feels like these are going to be really detailed kits, so you know they might be difficult to build, but the sort of the cost factor the accessibility of, in terms of they're less likely to be out of stock all the time like the old resin kits were, and sort of like the modularity and posability of these kits is going to be huge. Then we get on to the Shield Captain, which has some really phenomenal detail, like the sword and shield look fantastic. Again, the tall crest at the top looks awesome. And then I really love the detail of the embossed writing on the back, on the inside of the shield, because obviously it's going to be listing the Shield Captain's deeds down there. That's like a really nice touch. It does come with a bare head option, which is the first time we see a female custody, which is it's good that they finally done it, because they made the retcon ages ago, and I feel like this would have been better off doing alongside that rather than drip feeding us the bits around female custodies. But maybe they feel like that's the better way of managing it. In terms of the shield, like the design at the front for the Shield Captain looks really good. Like that's super detailed. And if you go up to the original design of the shields, yeah, you can see that there's like night and day difference. Like the regular ones are cool. The Shield Captain has a very good shield, as they should, really, being a Shield Captain. Then we've got the Ventari, which I think are sadly the weaker elements of the custodies in plastic. So these were always a very unique Forge World unit. The original custodian guards were just the same plastic ones that we had in UK, but these were a unique resin kit. They've got two build options. One is with the spears, and the other is with the pistol and buckler. They're jump pack items. They've got these brilliant wing designs. The wing design actually is different, but much like what we had with the Corsairs, the Eldari Corsairs, is they're basically just on rocks. They're like a foot off the ground on a tactical rock, and it really lets the models down, I think. You're losing that sort of imposing sense of jumping around and flying in the air, which you got with the original models. So let's just have a look at these. I mean, I don't mind the wing designs. I think that's quite cool. It's a very different, unique, I think it's a different shape from the original ones. But the fact that they're so low to the ground is really disappointing. I would like them to be higher up the ground. Maybe flight stands aren't the best, but here's the thing. If you really wanted to, you could just cut their foot off from the tactical rock, and then just with a small bit of wire, like you need something quite strong, have a rod going up a few inches and attach it from that rock piece to the foot, and then paint that black. And if it's small enough, it doesn't matter that it's technically visible. The black sort of tricks the eye into thinking it's not there, and that often looks better than like an acrylic plastic rod with an air bubble in, which is what you get in a lot of the normal kind of classic jump pack minis. So if we look at the original Forge World minis, which are still available from Games Workshop, you can see the vents at the top of the jump packs are much thinner and sleeker and don't really jump out in size. And I really like that aspect of it. The armor on the legs is actually much more kind of cloth based. And I think if I remember rightly, the armor that they have and the armor that the guys that ride the jet bikes have has a distinct name, and the save isn't actually as good, or it's the number of wounds is different in Heresy. Lore wise, their armor isn't as good as standard Custodes armor, because it needs to be lighter because they're on the bikes and because they're on jump packs. So there is a distinct difference here, which I don't think we get in the new version. So that is an interesting change. But you can see that the acrylic rod does kind of work here. It feels much more like they're jumping in the air and they're sort of floating or landing, at least. Yeah, I think there's something to them being higher up in the air than being, a foot off the ground on a tactical rock. Some of the designs of this original ones, I think, is slightly better than the new ones here. So it's interesting going back to the new ones. You can see that the top calf part of their legs actually isn't armored. the lower part is, and likewise their arms have more leather gauntlets than armor. So yeah, they've definitely kept some of those elements. The wings look a lot bigger, and the jet's sort of engine portion of the wings is a lot bigger. I guess it's worth noting that in terms of the Forge World units, this was a Forge World specific one. Obviously, all the vehicles and Contemptor Dreadnoughts also were Forge World, but there's more that we haven't seen yet that are. So there's the Agamastus Custodians, which were the Heresy-specific jet bikes. There was the Aquilian Custodians, which was the Heresy-specific Terminators, which are very different from the Games Workshop Terminators. And the Games Workshop Terminators were always much better because they never really bothered to update the points on their K1s to represent the fact that their rules just aren't as good. You had obviously the Ares and Orion gunships as well, so they're still to come at some point, we can only assume. And then there was the Sagittarian Custodies, which are the ones with the guns. They're like bolters and some experimental like beam weapon as well. So we haven't seen those yet either. And then lastly, we haven't seen any of the Sisters of Silence, so they haven't been touched here yet. So hopefully there'll be another wave where we see the remaining Forge World models be redone, but also we see more Sisters of Silence. And I think that is a bit of a shame that they haven't done that here, but it would be great to see them come out at some point in due course, which I'm sure they will. So then we've got some more of the Grav Tank Sisters, the Calidus one, which is the go-to tournament player one, I believe, for 40k, because it's just got a lot of punch and it does a lot of things that Custodies can't do on their own. And then lastly, we've got the Coronis Grav Carrier, which is a pretty big vehicle. And then at the very end, they mention that the data sheets for 40k are going to be updated. I don't know if that's to just bring them in line with what the weapon options are for these models, or if there's another reason behind it. I suspect, yeah, it's just that there might be a few different options here that you don't get in the 40k one. Whether they're going to make them both compatible at the same time, or they're just going to switch everything over to these new ones, that'd be quite interesting to see. And then I guess the sort of elephant in the room that I haven't really addressed so far is the female Custodies. And then Games Workshop, shortly after, I think it was a day or two afterwards, put out an article talking about it, and talking about Custodies are now being female. If we go back to, I think it was a year or so ago now when they first announced this, there was a lot of community backlash about it. There was a Warhammer Plus animation which featured the female Custodies, and that was quite cool. It was a good video. My take, between me and Dan, if I remember rightly, Dan didn't care too much, although it's annoying when they do retcon the lore. Mine was that it was a shame because actually I liked the dichotomy between having the female Sisters of Silence and male Custodies, and that as a sort of unit, as a fighting force with both men and women, but with their own separate roles, I thought was really interesting. You know, you've got Space Marines that are men, and then you've got Adeptus Sororitas, which are just women. And I thought Custodies was a good, or Talons of the Emperor, should I say, are a good mix where you have both distinct male and female forces. Now, actually, by making Custodies a mixture of male and female, they've also done a similar thing. It's sort of like the diversity of choice in terms of power armored models. So Space Marines are men, Sisters of Battle are women, and Custodies can be men or women, but then you also have Sisters of Silence that are just women, which fight alongside them. So it's still achieving a sort of diversity of choice, which I don't think is a bad thing. Let's see what they say. So they talk about, is this new? And they sort of say no, but all the models that we've seen up until now just look male, or the ones without helmets have always been male. It's worth noting that I guess a lot of the talk originally was in the lore. They talk about them being the sons of the noble houses, and they always refer to them as like sort of male pronouns, basically. So it isn't quite accurate to say like, well, they've always been ambiguous. Like it hasn't been, but they're making room to sort of retroactively spin it. And it's not too bad the way they've gone about it. Having this article would have been better to have done it when they first made the change, like over a year ago, rather than the tweet where they said, well, actually, they've always been female. You just didn't realize, which I think was a bit of a rage bait post for a lot of people. So has it been the best rollout? Probably not. And I think, to be fair, a lot of fans are mostly concerned about whether this means will we ever see female space marines, and I think a lot of people don't, and I feel like that's a valid thing to want to maintain the lore regardless of the original intentions. Apparently there were some female space marines or power armored models which were females back in Rogue Trader era, and they didn't sell. And then since then, they just pivoted to male space marines, and then they kind of canonically made that, fact with the law reasons. Does that mean if they want to make female space marines, they should, just because they technically could, because it's a business model? I don't think they should. I think, you've made your bed and you've created this law reason to justify why they're only male. So going back on it many years later is a bit disrespectful to the world building that you've done up until this point. Is it possible in a way to say, well, similar with Primaris Marines, well, going forwards, they could potentially be? That is something they could do. But interestingly, Primaris Marines had huge backlash when they first came because people didn't like the law justification. And then if you look at it now, they've kind of undone the concept of Primaris Marines. They've kind of just gone, yeah, they're all Primaris now, but so we don't refer to them as Primaris, and they're just all Space Marines. And they actually now start using a mix of armor. So I think the Primaris retcon or law change hasn't really proven to be that successful, because it feels like they've slowly backtracked on it over the years by making it disappear into the very ether of it's just something that Cool did. What's interesting, I guess, is when it comes to Space Marines and Custodies, very, myself included, I always assumed it was a similar process. I always viewed Custodies as a much more refined genetic engineering process, but similar to Space Marines. Space Marines is the mass-produced Ford car version in comparison to a sort of bespoke Ferrari or something like that. So I always assumed there were similar techniques in terms of how they were being gene created. And that gives you the scope to just sort of assume that all Custodies were male, even if that is maybe not their intention. I do sort of think the best way Games Workshop could have done this is when they first brought them back into 40k in 7th edition, I think it was. They should have just made the references to them being female back then, rather than giving us over 10 years of saying they're male and then going back on that. So that's just, there might be an internal politicking, internal reasons why they didn't want to do it then. I've heard people say that some people in Games Workshop really did want to push them to be female, and then other people not wanting to do that because there were no models that were female. And here they talk about them potentially coming from the sons of Terran houses, and they talk about the patriarchal houses, and yeah, that was a thing, and they did it to reinforce loyalty to the emperor. But they also said noble daughters could have been taken, and other methods of recruitment that were far more secretive. And yeah, this is quite a good way of trying to explain it. And then up here, when they do talk about the genetic alchemy for the process of Space Marines, is yes, it might feel like they're quite similar to Space Marines. They're actually not, and it's much more akin to, space magic, because it is so mysterious in terms of how they are created. Is worth noting that, as far as I'm aware, that custodies don't have a gene seed. And actually, that is probably the biggest distinction between Space Marines and custodies, is to say, actually, the gene seed is effectively analogous to, needing them to be men, whereas custodies don't need gene seed. That's why they could be both male and female. Now we get to some of the female heads. Personally, I'm not a fan of the ones with the long hair, because, like I said before, with the guy with a lot of hair or the guy with a mohawk, it just doesn't feel right for custodies. I'm a bit like, if you want to make them female, cool, but just give them all bald, shaved heads. I'm pretty sure the one in the Warhammer Plus animation is also bald as well, or has very short hair. Let's quickly look it up. Yes, so it turns out I was completely wrong. She does have hair, but it looks relatively short, or at least it's pinned back sort of within the armor. It's not like we have on these miniatures where it's almost like a huge top knot with loads of hair. And I guess that is almost like the downside of female Space Marines, is other than them having long hair, how are you really distinguishing them from being women? Stormcasts actually do this quite well. And, they've got slightly smaller proportions. They've got like different torso armor, but the legs and arms are noticeably smaller, which is a painful kit bashing for when I've been doing my Thunder Warriors, because obviously I'm doing all my Thunder Warriors as men, because they're basically precursors to Space Marines. But also just the scale of the female Stormcast is just slightly too small. It's really noticeable, even if it's only a millimeter or two difference in terms of like the thickness of the legs and the arms, and it just isn't really compatible with the Space Marine torsos that I'm using. So for every box of 5 miniatures I'm buying for my Thunder Warriors that are Stormcast, 2 of them I'm having to just not use at all and completely just put to one side because they're the female part. So from a kit bashing perspective, having distinct body shapes is terrible, whereas the custodies are ultimately the same regardless, and it's just a head swap, which does make things a lot easier to do. But then it's, how do you put in those female features? Is it just on the head? And they've obviously on one case gone for a big long lot of hair, because that's just an easy signifier. And they talk about how, down to the genetics and cellular level, they're exactly the same, flawless above all, and there's no difference in combat efficiency between the two. So, okay, cool. I guess here's the thing. Has it changed the lore? Yes. Is it the end of the world? Not really. Was I annoyed about it last year? Yeah, kind of, because it was a bit of a lore change. And I like the idea that you had the Sisters of Silence and the Custodies being a mixed faction of male and female specific archetypes. And now what you have is Custodies being male and female, and Sisters being female. It's not like in Space Marines where being a brotherhood is very foundational to the identity of Space Marines. I don't think you could really introduce female Space Marines without undoing a lot more of the identity of Space Marines. Whereas Custodies, I think they're a bit more mythical, and I think it's not the end of the world. So was I more annoyed last year than I am now? Yes. Have the Games Workshop gone about it in the best way possible? I don't think so. I think they could have rolled this out a lot better. My take last year was, if you're going to introduce the animation, give us some female models at the same time. In an ideal world, they should have just done this all back in 7th edition and sort of stuck with their guns back then. And I don't think anyone would have really cared back then. I think the biggest thing that they've done here is explicitly state that lore-wise Space Marines are men. And I mean, they haven't said they always will be, but that is sort of the implication. There are no female Adeptus Astartes. And I think a lot of the pushback from the idea of female Custodies is the worry that they will push this to the next level, which is female Astartes. And effectively, they said they're not doing that. So I think that ultimately is a sort of close and shut case for that sort of argument, which I think is good. Other people might disagree for whatever reason, and that's fine. Does this create any new interesting stories that you can tell with Custodes? No. Having females in Custodes doesn't really add anything. I think from a sort of interesting story-wise perspective, does it give people that play Custodes female representation? Yes. And I sort of feel like that's ultimately why they've wanted to do it. Obviously, there's been rumors about things like, the Neville show on Amazon. Maybe they want a female character that is in power armor. So maybe that's why they've been pushing for female custodies. I mean, who knows? I think just generally people want the idea of there being, female models in 40k. And I think that's a good thing. And actually, there is technically now female models in both the Space Marines and Chaos Marine range as well, because with Huron Blackheart's ensemble of models, you've got 2 female models. One of them's the human Navy commander. The other one is the female alien. And then with Titus's cohort, you've also got a bunch of female human characters there. And I sort of suspect that is one of the reasons why they've added those in, is to allow there to be effectively female representation and diversity within those very male-centric armies. And technically, even within Sisters of Battle, you do have some male miniatures. Admittedly, they are tied to the Penitent engines, but they do technically exist as well, even though I don't think they're actual Sisters of Battle. I guess Sisters of Silencer is probably the only range that is now a sort of, single sex faction if we're going down the sort of nuts and bolts of it. Obviously, you've got things like orcs, which are, fungus and what have you. Anyway, that is some ramblings and musings about female Custodes. I'd be interested to know if you're pulling your hair out, or if you're chilled with it, or if you think it's good. You can let me know down in the comments. And hopefully my take's been rather balanced and not frothing at the mouth. So yeah, that is it for Custodes. Let's move on to the rest of the Heresy range. On with the theme of Heresy, we've got some other new models, specifically vehicles. So we've got the Glaive Super Heavy Special Weapon Tank with a huge, I think, Volkite gun on here, which looks pretty cool. Yeah, so it says it's got the Vulcanite carronade, which is this huge turret-mounted weapon, and obviously on the sponsons you've got these quad las cannons on either side, so packs a lot of punch. And then in the hull, it looks like it's got a twin flamer option. So like I said before, with the Custodes stuff, this will be pretty much a one-for-one redesign of the old resin kits. So it will be much lighter, it'll be much cheaper within reason, and not necessarily actually easier to build, because it will just be so many parts. But in terms of transporting and, overall ease of construction, yes, it technically will be, because you won't have to deal with resin. But there are some charms of resin where, the entire side piece of the track will be probably one big piece of resin, which, yes, you need to clean and wash and, add a tiny bit of track on where the casting gate was. But that will go together so much quicker than the 50 pieces that you will probably need to assemble that one track. So there is an element of resin, which is actually a joy to build once you get into it. And obviously I've been doing it for quite a long time now, so I've become a bit of an expert at the finicky details of resin and knowing how to deal with the problems, but also the benefits of resin. Whereas a lot of people just can't get past that. So I totally understand why plastic is king for most people. I have one weird takeaway when it comes to the plastic tanks, and that is they're just too crisp. Like the straight edges on the vehicles are just flawlessly flat, which is, what you want from a plastic, but it gives it a slight uncanny valley to it. Whereas the old resin vehicles, there's a little bit of wobble to the flat surfaces, which ultimately looks more realistic. from a scale model point of view, it looks more like an actual vehicle, because large scale tanks aren't going to be uniformly flat, flush surfaces. There's going to be a little bit of texture to it. There's going to be a little bit of denting and warping and things like that, which that is the one thing I sort of miss with the original old resin kits, is there's a sort of a level of believability sort of baked into that natural sort of hand sculpted design and molding process that you unfortunately lose with, you know, both the concept of 3D design, but also the plastic kits. I don't want to say it's soulless, but there was a real charm to a lot of the old resin kits, including vehicles, but especially like infantry characters and stuff like that. Then we're on to the less super heavy vehicles. We've got the Whirlwind missile tank. I love the old school sort of rhinos. I love this Whirlwind tank. It just reminds me of the old White Dwarf conversion guide that was in there. I did it for the Chimera. I don't know if there was a specific one for the Whirlwind, but basically it has that similar sort of look to it, where you took the back of an old square base, like the monster size square bases, and in that you had all these circles, which would basically be your missile tubes. And that would be your front piece. You would like cut it in half, and that would be your front piece. And then you would use a plasticard to build out the rest of the missile launcher bit. And that's what this reminds me of. So sort of weirdly, for nostalgia, this is like a 10 out of 10 model for me. It just looks fantastic. And then the coloring, like the way it's painted, like it's incredible. Yes, it's very much a heavy metal style rather than the old school Horus Heresy of the first edition. I think I'm coming round to it finally. But you know, I love that old school painting style as well. But yeah, the Whirlwind looks phenomenal. Got loads and loads of detail on it. It just looks gorgeous. And obviously, if you're a player of Heresy, you'll probably want to get hold of this. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of good enough that you could probably use it for the right army in 40k as well, even though there's a very different kit. And then this is all coming in a Journal Tactica, which are the small, not quite black books that they're producing for Heresy. This is called Mailed Fist, which talks about the Legion Astartes super heavy tanks. So it's going to have a bunch of rules, lore, image and artworks. And, I think they go for around 15 quid. So they're relatively cheap for what they are, noting that they'll only really be valid for this edition. So that's something to always bear in mind. And that is it for the Heresy part of the preview. That's all for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please let me know your thoughts and feelings down in the comments below. And hopefully you'll see me again soon for another video. Until next time, take care.